Welcome, everyone, to the Native Voices in STEM seminar series. This is the final Native Voices in STEM seminar for the spring 2026 semester. And on behalf of Native Fuse Alliance and the Indigenous Resilience Center, we want to welcome you and everyone that is on the Zoom platform as well. We're really excited to welcome Dr. Hector Ortiz Cano to the University of Arizona. My name is Dr. Carletta Chief, and I'm the director of the Indigenous Resilience Center and professor in environmental science. I'm also a member of the Navajo Nation. In January 2026, we were proud to partner with Cultural Survival to do an Indigenous food sovereignty knowledge exchange in Mexico. We brought our tribal community partners from the region down to Mexico, along with the partners from Cultural Survival, to do a knowledge exchange on food sovereignty. And at that time, during that week of this amazing knowledge exchange, we were able to meet Dr. Hector Ortiz Cano. And our time there was so beautiful. We learned so much from our Indigenous relatives down in Mexico. And the mission of the Indigenous Resilience Center is to center our communities, their knowledge in co-design of solutions towards environmental challenges that they face. And so we're just really excited. This year we've been able to not only go to Mexico and visit our relatives there, but also to Canada to visit our First Nation relatives there. So we're trying to do some international exchange in our fourth year as our center has just recently started 4 years ago. So I want to welcome everybody here. We have food outside and we have several people online, and we want to thank Cultural Survival for the Spanish translation because we do have our relatives who attended that trip online as well. And so the Spanish translation is for them as well. So we look forward to continued partnership and want to thank Liz Peterson from the Arizona Institute for Resilience, the Howry program, and social and environmental resilience here as well, and many of you all here who are part of our programs. So at this time, I'll give it over to Danny Siciaga Jr., who's the Associate Director, to provide welcoming remarks. Thank you. And
Kamagat Mubak, Daniel Sistiaga Imo. How are y'all doing? Awesome. It's good to see so many beautiful faces. My name is Daniel Sistiaga, and I come from the Fort Yuma Quetzal tribe in Yuma, Arizona, and I serve as the Assistant Director for the Indigenous Resilience Center here at the University of Arizona. Before we get started, we always like to provide a land acknowledgement, and so we respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona that is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Arizona being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. The Native Voices in STEM seminar series is co-sponsored by the Indigenous Resilience Center, the University of Arizona Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, the Water Resources Research Center, and the Native Fuse Alliance, and the Office of Societal Impact. The seminar series highlights Native scientists, engineers, educators, leaders, and social activists, providing students with an opportunity to network and learn about the research and careers of Native leaders in various fields. Each session includes a Q&A segment at the end where all attendees are encouraged to engage with the speaker, ask questions, and participate in the discussion. We would like, and as Dr. Chief mentioned, we would especially like to thank Cultural Survival for their assistance and sponsorship with our translation services. For those of you that are joining, we have put directions in the Zoom, in the chat for you how to see how to enable that service. It gives me great pleasure to welcome my tío, So Dr. Hector Ortiz Cano, who is Yoreme, is a conservation scientist at the Chicago Botanic Garden, whose work bridges plant ecology and cultural heritage and indigenous agricultural knowledge. His current talk, Building Bridges Between Plant Cultural Knowledge and Conservation Science, an intercultural approach built respecting and preserving our traditional values, explores how ancestral agricultural practices and indigenous ecological knowledge of plants like amaranth and agave can inform conservation and climate resilient agriculture in arid regions. A descendant of Pima and Totonaca peoples with cultural ties to the Yoreme community, Dr. Ortiz Cano integrates traditional foodways, seed stewardship, and regenerative land practices into his research, demonstrating how indigenous land stewardship can guide more sustainable and resilient futures. On a personal note, I've had the privilege to meet Dr. Ortiz Cano during a trip to Mani, Mexico, as part of our U.S. and Mexico Indigenous Regenerative Agricultural Knowledge Exchange in 2026 that was co-convened by Cultural Survival and the Indigenous Resilience Center. Hector was so enthusiastic and eager to share all about his work, and we just knew that when we had an opportunity, we needed to get him down to Tucson. And so with that, it gives me great joy to have him here with us at the U of A. We have jam-packed his entire schedule, so he's probably going to get tired of us by Thursday. But we're excited to be able to welcome him and have him share more about his work today. So with that, can you all please help me give a round of applause and welcome Dr. Ortiz Cano.
That sounds good. Maybe close it right there. All right. Well, gracias, mijo. Gracias, Dr. Sheep. Thank you, mijo. Thank you, Dr. Sheep. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to me to be here. I'm very excited. I'm very enthusiastic of sharing, as I'm sharing with my brothers and sisters, from Cultural Survival for University of Arizona back in Yucatan. And here's an honor, to share a little bit of what, who we are and what we do as a living, but also as a Yoreme. Let me introduce myself as a Orgrid. Yo soy Chiñabo, Quechimaleya, Inapo Hector Ortiz, Saila Yoreme. Thank you. My name is Hector Ortiz. I'm hermano, brothers, Yoreme tribe from southern Sonora, Mexico. So a little bit about myself. So I'm a conservation scientist at the Chicago Botanic Garden, as I was shared. But also, integrating these spaces, cultural spaces, and ecology. So saying that, respectfully following or land acknowledgement, and the way that also, bringing a little bit of our culture here, respectfully sharing a little bit of where the Yoreme's eyes, in Southern Sonora. I wanna start with this short video in a warm summer in August in Southern Sonora, Mexico. One of our future, this is our future, Pascola dance, that is grabbing this torch of what we're doing here. As we, acknowledge, that we are brothers and sisters from this Mother Earth, that we are brothers and sisters from the same Mother Earth, and then we're coming here together in this land that we borrow from our ancestors, but also we pass, to the next generation. While we is 7 generations, ahead. So that resonates in the past, but also in the future. So saying that, I want to show you a little bit just to start here, back here. This is our John Ivan. From your learning or direction away and the way practicing to what is our ceremonies, our dances, or particular, the viejo de la fiesta. They call these parties, but it's going to hear. I want to point out that this is the beats of our Mother Earth. I'm getting a little emotional, so I'm gonna come down. And the important here, is to acknowledge also, what we're doing here for the future. What are we doing here also to model this space for others that, and also sharing, our cultural space that can resonate, into what we do as ecologists, for example, in my profession. So this is a significant time, in the history that we can share with others what are traditions, but also how can we use this knowledge that wisely we can use this knowledge in a way that we can, everyone in this climate change, in this space, that we could join these efforts. So saying that, so why we bridging, this cultural knowledge and conservation science? This picture that you see here, it's a Yucatan, the regenerative agriculture meeting that we have here in the middle. Our colleague Amy Robertson at Cultural Survival. Here, our brother Raramuri Makawi, and here myself. But also, bringing this torch or bringing this responsibility to exchange with others in this, cultural space, but also, in our mother Earth. So our culture has been shaped ecologically, no matter which tradition, no matter which group we're coming from, no matter which roots, coming from, we always go to this cycle to ecology, or mothers, grandparents, great grandparents. If we look to the roots, they've been living from this land. They've been using this land for thousands of years, and here we are protecting, preserving, and and in conservation science, when you see a very specific, as a scientist, a conservation scientist, here you see my colleague Gaby Rocha at the Chicago Botanic Garden, a curator, of this collection of Arucarpus fissuratus. Arucarpus fissuratus is a false peyote. Peyote has been used for thousands of years by several groups as part of their culture. So this plant, it's an example of the power of someone that has this cultural roots and is interested in repatriating from, this Arucarpus fissuratus was confiscated in O'Hare in Chicago. And then we are in the process of repatriating this plant to motherland in Mexico. So this example, how it's translated to culture, how it's translated to cultural understanding when we have sometimes lost our roots or lost this connection with origins. In Mexico, there's 99% our connection of people with pueblos originarios, with indigenous, though it's a reality that we have lost a lot of our culture and our traditions. So saying that, this example of bridging plant cultural knowledge and conservation science, it could be as an example also for others to find these connections, find this knowledge that has been lost. And it has several roots, several branches that we can analyze. From this perspective, so these methodologies, indigenous methodologies, scientific methodologies that has been gravitating in this space, when we align them together, it can add understanding, in the past, but of the future of our ecosystems, but also in our culture and this connection. And then this cooperation, it can, now that we are in the time that we need policy, but it's more important, make us better human beings. And here, I have these pictures, of Yolentequia, or Museum of Cultural Center in Southern Sonora, Mexico. Here's my panino, and here you see this picture of a fiestero wearing one of the regalia, and he has passing, through existence, the deer. But here, like in Yolentequia also, we have these problems that a lot of our knowledge, a lot of the traditions are threatened. Biocultural loss is a thing that's happening fast in the Sonoran Desert. So the approach of bridging plant cultural knowledge is essential, is crucial of what we do. My presence here is part of the work that my ancestors also, it's a continuation of our ancestors. Everyone here, we have a continuation of our ancestors. In this case, the Yoreme, so we have lost lots of knowledge. And here, in the case of Arizona, for example, in the particular case of agave, for example, that I'm going to be talking about agave, we have a lot to learn of a plant that has been lost in history, a lost crop a plant that has been cataloged or has been described as a lost crop that connects, our ancestors in the land and how it was cultivated, back in time. A lot to learn in many directions, as I say, the plant cultural knowledge. But where we at, in the initial conversations on these cultural spaces and ecology. And here, I decided to put some of our classrooms. What is Western science and where does indigenous people learn? So here you see this picture. This picture was taken at the Morton Arboretum in Chicago with my colleague here giving a presentation on the conservation of trees by IUCN, preparing in this workshop to deploy a team in Vietnam to talk about conservation of trees in Asia. Here you can see, here's my mijo, Dani Sestiega, here sitting right here in Yucatan. And here you could see, like listening from a traditional farmer, what are their practices, exchanging their knowledge. So here, there's a lot that we could learn from both sides. The magic has happened when we can find, points of conversation. Climate change it's global biodiversity. Climate change is one of the main things that everyone is concerned about what's happening. Biodiversity loss is happening fast with climate change. Now, also realistic conversations, what are our limitations, not just the Western science, but also from indigenous perspectives. How our systems has been shaped through time and has been uneven, let's say, and for indigenous people and in Western world. Though this is a window of opportunity for everyone to have these conversations. Now, as many of you have heard, like our hands, indigenous hands of our ancestors, of our families, have been taking care of the land for thousands of years. Now, there's a lot that we can learn as good neighbors, non-indigenous, indigenous people, and in whatever direction, but also acknowledging what is the ethical dimensions. As a scientist and as an indigenous person, also thinking what is sharing, how we conceptualize our traditions or values, what is for our tribes, what is kept for our tribes, and what is shared. So there's two different kind of knowledge, but we can learn from each other to respect each other, and making sure we're moving in sovereignty, honoring our indigenous, our ancestors, and intellectual traditions. Now, in the past, we used to think indigenous knowledge it was behind or far from Western knowledge, but the reality is the science of our ancestors, indigenous science, it's at the same level as the Western knowledge. So saying that, there's a movement right now in science. I attend to this meeting, the Native Seeds Conference, National Native Seeds Conference, to the seminar given by Dr. Robin Walkemter, and she used this picture to illustrate how our knowledge, it's at the same level, indigenous knowledge of our ancestors and our knowledge, our communities, it's at the same level of the science level. Now, when we think about these two knowledges, and when we are aware, and at what point we converge, respecting traditions, but also with that spirit of culture and the spirit of collaboration with science, is where we moving forward towards a mutual understanding, a mutual cooperation, respectfully, fair, that we could achieve these goals that they say, yes, so we can work together through understanding us, understanding each other. Now, putting myself as an example, and maybe I'm not the best example in many things, but in the science that happened, imagine John Hector, I'm not going to say how many decades, a few decades ago, living in a community in the Yoreme Nation. And there are several stories, coming and say, yeah, I want to do a master's. I graduated with a bachelor in engineering, and I'm an agronomist, and I want to do a master's. And I say, yes, which ecological problem I could help my community? Then say, oh, cottonwood or sacred tree. Okay, so I wrote a proposal, and I was looking for funding, and they were like, took it to the university. That's a great proposal, but how about if you look at a different model? My first contact with science, they say, okay, so we'll let you pick that model, and then say, hey, John Hector, scientist, and say, which model I'm gonna pick? And say, yes, I love food. Say, okay, so which is meaningful for my people, which is meaningful for me? And say, calites, amaranths. And say, yes, I grew up eating amaranths. And that was the first exposure that I had to science that built and shaped what is it like. I want to learn through the eyes of science what's happening with this cultural significant plant, not knowing what was going to happen in the future with my science or what my career had through science. Now, here you see John Hector holding some calites, and a friend, good friend, Emmanuel Vidaña, that was helping me, my experiments. Here's a picture, of our field. So it says like my playground back home, where I harvest, and I forage calites, the food, or sacred food or sacred plant. And now I have a story. I'm gonna weave a little bit of personal stories. And I have stories. When I moved from Mexico to the United States 13 years ago, maybe some people say it's a little embarrassing, but I'm going to share with you. I never had dental work. In Mexico, it's expensive. But like I moved here and say, what you've been eating in Mexico that your teeth looks really good? And say, well, I've been eating calites and frijoles and beans. So that's the power, like our stories, like through cultural eyes, when we see, when we culturally aware of where science, is moving forward. Another story is the story of agave. So growing up, Grandpa Hector, my Grandpa Hector, Hector Jr., technically, so he took me to the field, and he used to harvest these beautiful agave plants. He used to harvest and trade it up in the mountains for mezcal bacanora. And he used to go, I remember watching him and then say, going to specific places to harvest plants. Then with time, I did help Grandpa, and I was harvesting the plants for Grandpa to trade for mezcal. I didn't get any, my Grandpa got all. But what happened with time, after my master's, I became an engineering and technical expert on agave for bacanora in Sonora, Mexico. So my first big project with the National Council of Forestry in Mexico was helping the farmers, small farmers, to sustainable produce bacanora, which is like the knowledge of how it has been passed through generations. I don't like many cultures can trace, what's the generation of farmers, but also it's in different cultures. This knowledge, it became part of me, a part of my plan that through my journey also. Then what happened through the PhD, I was studying agaves. It's a cycle. When we see life through our cultural eyes, also we acknowledge that we are in this cycle of life. So we go to sit in these places that we had to be and that connects, to our culture. Then later, as a scientist, after PhD, one postdoc, not many, and my position at Chicago Botanic Garden, going back home, this research on agave to integrate it into cultural systems, like has been lost, the knowledge of agave has been key to open conversations into what populations of agave and what we're going to do for the future, how we're going to pass this knowledge, how we're going to engage with community to integrate not just the cultural knowledge that has been lost or has been passed in existence with science and the climate change. So here's my colleague, Dr. Olga Beltran, at the University of Sonora, that she's been helping me to monitor these long-term research plots on agave to understand the physiology of agave, but also integrating with the students, indigenous students in Southern Sonora, this knowledge, this cultural knowledge, revitalizing this cultural knowledge that it was a staple for us and it got lost in time, but also we can understand and improve our practices and how we're going to cultivate for the future. So here you see this kind of research. I mean, it's just a picture, but thermal infrared, for example, I was never exposed when I was in Southern Sonora. Probably didn't exist, a thermal camera when I was in Southern Sonora. Now we have these tools like photosynthesis, thermal infrared, which I'm a geophysiology scientist, that can be integrated at the same level as our cultural knowledge can be advanced for the future of our people. But how does this happen, And then, I think this one is blocking. But, what's the plants, with the cultural knowledge and the conservation science eyes? Especially, in the, thank you, Mijo. But purposely, seeking, cultural and scientific connection and understanding application in several contexts. And here I include this picture, our knowledge is not primitive. And what is it? It's a pathway. It's a pathway to relearn, or some scientists to go back to traditional knowledge, even though it's this book was written by an Ojibwe person, but an Ojibwe scientist. It's also give us some starting point to reflect on how we're going to come back here with our family in our ceremonial ways, that respectfully we can work with our communities, understand our tradition, the importance of our traditions, understand the importance of participating in our traditions, and then how can we build an open path for others in our communities. Now, summarizing this example is like who we're gonna be the godfather, the panino, who we're gonna pass that torch that someday they will come back to community and go out and then come back to community to continue this work, improving our communities. Now, saying that so many communities have struggled with so many problems, social, economic, ecological problems. So that's key for what we do. Now, in our programs, we're converging the botanic gardens, like a scientist. Can you hear me, okay? So, okay, as a scientist of the Botanic Garden Network in the United States, which of those projects, which of those initiatives, can we use to model this approach? Now, starting with the agave program. So this is the summary of my dissertation work in 2021, working with the Hohokam agave. And I'm going to share more details on this, but it has been consulted to 2026, 922 times across the planet. So here you can trace how this work has been traced through time. And then when you look at this, these agaves, in a depleted rock pile, and say, yeah, how is it this, model that happened here in Tucson, like thousands of years ago, how agave was cultivated by the Hohokam can impactful, shape or ways, the conservation in the botanic gardens, and then can inspire others. So reflecting, initial conversations and potential, where everything started. the project, initially didn't start to say, yes, we're gonna integrate the cultural aspect. When that happened, it happened right after, we noticed that this system, it was a cultural system that has to be honored in a proper way, and it has to be kept in a way that can be shared to the right audience. And then here we are. And bear with me. So initially, what are the basic aspects? What are the very basic questions that we had that time? My supervisor was helping me to elaborate, what we want to learn. So like, what are the basic aspects of rock piles? What rock piles, like a dryland farming techniques for the future climate change, when we're using rock piles. And then, like the science, at that time, it was, so everyone was talking about, we need a crop, drought tolerant for the US, like it can be, like in return, economically to the drylands in the US. And then here, this paper, by John Cushman, at that time, it was resonating in the community, in the scientific community, non-Indigenous. And then here, like a Hohokam lost crop found by Wendy Hodgson in 2018, and say, a lost crop was found. Wait a second. That plant has been for thousands of years, used in the Sonoran Desert. Wendy, a good mentor, we have had so many conversations say, did you really found that lost crop? I think, like we can reframe, what you say. Lots of conversations. But then, like in that line, they say like, so as an agave expert, in the Sonoran Desert, in the other side of the border, say, it totally makes sense, when you look at the crops, the agave, you say, water use efficiency. And here you can see, compared to different crops, like wheat, corn, and agave, how low water, needs to be cultivated. But the logic behind, when we look at the landscape, and I say, I'm going to recall, Grandpa, that say, we walk these landscapes. So we know that these landscapes, they were sacred landscapes. They were landscapes that our ancestors walked. They were landscapes that, we could find agave. And say, okay, and then here's a Tumamo Hill, where the rock pile fields, occur. More complicated, this agave that different, very different than other crops. They work, like a very, through evolution, a very specific, photosynthetic way to, I was going to say, that works. And I say like, so a lot of the science say, what are we going to do, to measure this crop? And I say, how are we going to, talk about this in a respectful way when it's the right time? Moreover, the rock piles, the ecology, now as ecologists say like, it didn't happen. Our ancestors were very, very sophisticated in the way that they did things. One of the things, that we know is that the agricultural techniques that they use, they were considering pretty much every detail of the ecosystem and in every detail of the plants that they were cultivating. And here's an example in this landscape, how they understood, the hydrology of the landscape to irrigate, like agave, using a very specific water catching technique, rock piles, and what elevation range, and then, how the rain, occurred to water this crop that feed thousands of people, not just, families. There was thousands of people. A very, like a very interesting, and I was going to say, literature, if you want to consult, Paul and Susie Fish, that they spend their whole life understanding Hohokam rock piles. They understood some part of the story and the Hohokam agave. Here you see Paul and Susie Fish, first time visiting Tucson, taking me to the Hohokam rock piles and say, but how did you build a rock pile? How did you, even this depleted rock pile, how did you construct this rock pile? Of course, you have this illustration, like in Arizona, and say, we think that that's the way that, the people did it in Arizona. Well, we have so many discussions, conversations, say we need to build a modern rock pile field to understand this crop. Of course, like understanding also the cultural significance of this plant. At that time, I was in my second year of my PhD, and I say it reframed a lot of the cultural understanding of agave as a crop through my personal eyes, through my personal family, through my eyes, cultural eyes, and through other people that have discussions. But anyway, respectfully, I remember going and say like, oh, my Pima ancestors say, Nana Juliana, please help me. I'm in trouble. I'm a PhD and I'm in trouble. I need to design this rock pile field for graduating with my PhD. What happened is, okay, so I went with Paul Susie Fish and I explained the situation, say, okay, a way that we could do is modeling using machine learning techniques, maybe that could help us to build a rock pile. Say we collect thousands of pictures of depleted rock piles. And these sedimentary rocks, even though there's like in the landscape, depleted rock piles, it's very important key into how the rock piles feel, how the rock piles work with agave. So we ended up with this model and say, okay, first thing, check. Then the monumental task, they say, where are we going to build this rock pile field to understand how are we going to do it also respectfully? At that time, consulting in the Mayo with some of our elders and say, well, first thing first, you gotta respect, what you're doing. And say, if you got as permission, if your grandpa, know that plant, talk to your grandpa. And then the magic happened. That nervous PhD student built this rock pile field to understand how these rock piles work with agave. Then here you see the final product and say, yeah, we have rock piles, we have agave to measure rock piles. The next thing, you say like how we integrate agronomics, agriculture, knowledge, the basic principles. Do we integrate modeling, upper division modeling and agriculture, mathematical modeling to understand, the crop? Do we integrate which tools we're going to integrate? How are we going to do it? Then what we want to learn on that? And say the efficiency. Then look at the eyes of our ancestors, looking at the eyes of ancestors. If we're in the landscape, what are those things that our ancestors were looking? What they were looking? We're looking, like in a hot desert. Say, oh, these rock piles. And that's it, the process of thinking, reflecting, trying to understand, that journey. Say, well, these rock piles might be, like helping to insulate the soil or temperature. Here's a drone picture of a rock pile field. And then you see, how underneath the rocks, it's hot. The red, it means hot. Here, the blue is cooler, purple. And then here what we found. These measurements that we were doing in agave, so indeed, they were creating this insulation effect on the soil, also affecting the moisture of the rock piles compared to bare soil. And here you see, even in small, like in small timeline in weeks, you see, how affect moisture underneath. But most important, the moisture is important, but also how we're affecting biologically these plants. Interestingly, when we think about our ancestors, what they were doing, and then the degree of sophistication that they have, their agricultural techniques, you don't think often, as a crop, like as an agriculturist, as agronomist, you don't think often they say like, yes, so they were observing also these effects on the plants. And then here you can see compare rock piles, photosynthesis, high photosynthesis, or high CO2 gas exchange, low CO2 gas exchange, and compare rock piles versus bare soil. Now, the question was, in current time, where we should apply these rock piles. Yes, so dryland farming is a thing. It's been in the in discussion for so long in Arizona and the Sonora Desert, both sides of the border. So we took this, these lessons that we learned, and then say, yeah, so there's some ecological characteristics of the landscape that we could potentially, in that time, using the data that we have in Sonora, Mexico, say, yes, we could understand, how elevation, precipitation, it played an important role. A lot of, this is bad for my ADHD, I'm sorry, but lots of lines. But we say like rock piles here, for example, in red, and grasslands and in agave species, how these elevation ranges matter, but the precipitation also. But more important is mapping these rock piles, these potential dryland farmings, this dryland farming technique that can be applied in different landscapes in the Sonoran Desert. Here you see Arizona, rock piles. Here you see how crossing the borders, rock piles in the borders, and in grasslands in northern Mexico. When we combine with agave species, this is what we learn. Here in the Mayo Valley, southern Sonora, Mexico, where I'm from, the potential of dryland farming using rock piles in the future here. Here's another species, in Arizona that can be implemented, learning, the rock piles. Moving forward, talking with ecologists, botanists, here you see Wendy Hodgson, Andrew Sullivan, myself, Susie Fish, going to these ancestral places in the Chihuahuan Desert, Paquibe specifically. Here we're collecting, some data, but then, like something came there, something clicked. And then say, I found this deer song that I'm borrowing from the Yoreme, or brothers on the Yoreme, that you see, like what it says, here, that in our ceremonies, what it says the ecological descriptors of agave. Say, oh, but right at the end of my PhD, what I found, I said, oh, and I've been in the Ramada, and I've been listening or singing your deer singers too, in the Mayo. Oh, there's something there that I wasn't aware, like I said, yes, these historic ancestral, like practices specific, and for the case of the agave dryland farming, it can inform modern, agave research in a cultural way, respectfully. And then here, like a model, like a propose, say, okay, if modern agave cultivation is connected to our history or cultural history and in conservation. So, and then here, like in 2023, I was invited by my colleague Sarah Davis to put it in context. And here in this paper, I feel a need to start this journey also acknowledging what's the agave, like the cultural meaning of agave for some of our relatives of the Yaqui tribe, with respect, to Yaqui, brothers and sisters that are here and that are joining us, and other cultures, that use agave. So moving forward, how do we bridge, this cultural knowledge and conservation science now in modern time? As an indigenous scientist, how this knowledge that has been passed in both worlds, the Western world and the cultural world, how do we bridge it in our spaces now as a scientist? Here you see a picture of my lab. Here you see some agave tests, that we're doing with the Lycor 6400 and photosynthesis, trying to figure out, some of the techniques, but here also thinking on these lessons that we have learned, through cultural understanding, through a journey, cultural understanding in different stages of our career, as a scientist. Here you see some of my indigenous scientists, students, here collecting data in Southern Sonora, Mexico, and how we can move this approach, to different phases, now passing these lessons, not just the scientific lessons, but the cultural lessons through the next generation of scientists, which we believe, these approaches, like understanding, like the learning also that they're not just rock piles, but also several systems, not just in Arizona, but across the landscape, like crossing borders. If you go from Arizona all the way to the Atacama Desert, we're still finding traces of this system, dryland farming systems, that needs the cultural understanding and that needs the scientific understanding at the same time in the current context. So here we have, some of the research, like here's how we integrated, these selective vegetation systems in Southern Sonora, Mexico, to cultivate agave combined. And then, all these variables that sometimes we don't see when we're doing the research into the thermal, for example. What is the benefits? Growing up, cultivating agave underneath the mesquite, they didn't have that understanding. But now that I see with these eyes, like two eyes, from the Western science and from the indigenous science, say, oh, Grandpa knew what he was doing. Now the approach, and it's like quoting Dr. Michael Johnson. Now, with the approach where we are, really is, with the scientists, reframing your ways to do science. And this is, a framework that has been consulted, with my Panino and the Yoreme Nation, say like, yes, we have to build trust, scientists. We have to train our scientists to interact with community. We need to train the community to collect the data to transfer technology. We need a community assessment on the scientific team. And we need, community members, in together building this page or this new chapter and respecting our traditions, respecting our values. And here you see, some of my heart, in my community, where I spend some time, like a lot of time, when I'm visiting my Panino. Another lesson, learn is just like the traditional knowledge, in agriculture and botanical knowledge, at the, learning those histories, scouting through these, materials that can help us also to build more and then to pass the community these lessons that has been, but also, acknowledging, like our history, our harsh history, which is part of also our healing, communities, to acknowledge, the past and looking forward to the future. What are we going to do? So how are we doing with time? Okay, perfect. So recently, in 2024, I was invited at the Botanic Conservation International Botanic Garden Conservation International. I'm sorry, let me reframe it. Botanic Gardens in Conservation International, that they did build this roadmap to crop wild relatives and invited me to put it in context into botanic research, conservation, and indigenous communities, and say, what can we do to improve these crop wild relatives priorities? When I say crop wild relatives, I'm talking about agave, I'm talking about amaranth, I'm talking about corn. These crops that our ancestors domesticate, semi-domesticate, and give it to us, many ways, provide to us, through history, that we are trying to preserve. And say, yeah, so in the case of Sonora, Southern Sonora, Mexico, we're talking about 2,800 plants at least, that we had to in these crop wild relatives and ecosystems. And if you look at this, like priorities, understand, document, protect, collect, conserve, ex situ, accessibility, raise public awareness. Yes, it totally makes sense in a climate change, in a conservation ecosystems, in a conservation, the crops for the future. But what is missing? So communities. The knowledge of the communities, hasn't been integrated yet or wasn't integrated yet into what's the indigenous research. Our communities has indigenous scientists. It has like higher education, they've been through the universities that we can integrate into accessibility, making accessible these approaches, these science to indigenous people, to indigenous communities, to indigenous scientists. And these are the recommendations that, like, the suggestions, provided. And this framework, and the reflection, where we are in conservation science with respect, to our communities. And then you see, so Western science had focused on climate change solutions, plants, and then developing institutionally and community. But what is needed is a reframing from the community perspective. What are those problems? What are those connections? What are those things that we're doing, or what the communities are doing in their ecosystem to develop towards climate change solutions? And then see, here's a proposed framework into conservation science for these crops. But what is needed, in a reflection to indigenous scientists that we've been trained in Western science, and we still hold ties with the cultural and the roots. It means you'll say, yes. So in every space, that we are, it's a thing that we follow our ancestors by. Circling back, what are reflections, through education, through higher education, to a PhD, to very specialized knowledge, and say, yes, continue participating in our communities, accepting responsibilities, learning, teaching others, and also, continue our work, as a Western scientist, to open to those ones that wants to, or interested in joining us. And then here see my sombrero de chicharrón here in Chihuahua, and then here my sombrero de chicharrón in Chicago. We are the same. I mean, it's even but what it means, these lessons, that we have learned, that we have shared, that we are advocating, for communities, it has, like that, our participation, it's key to continue developing the frameworks that we need to for communities and to create or help others to inspire others to continue exploring science, but also to regain value in our traditions, cultural values, but also putting a big pictures of the many things that we could do as community, not just as indigenous scientists, but as a community, a cooperation. And then here's some of examples, for example, that personally I've been exposed, the buffalo grassland restoration, for example, that it's this example that has been, developed for decades now, successfully collaboration between Western science and indigenous science. And then we see, this expanding, through the total island, like from Canada, United States, and Mexico. Then here you see some of the pictures in Yucatan, like germplasm. What are we doing, to protect this germplasm, from our communities? We'll also have this conversation, mutual understanding, what it means, what it values for us, the seeds or relatives. For science, what's the protocols? What are we going to do? We are colliding in space. Here, respectfully, I was invited to the Chippewa, the Bad Rivers and the Great Lakes, wild rice, for example. Another example, of many things that this multicultural, intercultural approach that can we learn from each other, no matter what part we are in the Sonoran Desert, up in the Midwest. Final thoughts. So here, my panino, that has opened his heart and sharing, his knowledge, but also, here inviting, my community, participate, not just me, open, as many people can come and join me. And then here, this wonderful group of people, community, that we gather together to exchange in a far, far land, beautiful Yucatan. And then here, where the magic is happening, where the conservation science is actively, shared, but also, what is the future of what we're doing as a community, as scientists and indigenous scholars, practitioners. So saying that, thank you so much for listening.
So right now we're going to go ahead and open it up to any questions in the room and online. So yeah.
Yeah.
And then I'm bringing it back to you.
Does anybody have any questions?
Then.
Thank you so much for your talk. One thing that really struck me was how, right, when you were talking about starting your research and then parts of like asking your elders, for students who maybe not in their community or doing work in their community, what like strategies do you have for them to find out who's the right people to talk about for asking permission?
I left when I was 17 years old, my community. And it wasn't easy. I was going to say, like finding wisdom, inside of us, like remembering, going back, and then I'm getting emotional. Asking, or grandpa, for me, Nana Juliana, grandma, and there's a lot of people, that is there, scientists, has followed the same path, I have say, for me, every opportunity to listen like an elder, and is sharing, no matter which, you're sharing with the heart, knowledge. And then said like identifying that space, that's key. And said like I kindly, like some elders have shared, some of their knowledge. I'm very lucky, man. That I can learn. I have an example. I was visiting, the Chippewa Nation, the Bad Rivers Reservation. An elder, was sharing about wild rice, and I said like wild rice. Hey, yeah, the wild rice that's being extracted from our communities is like is like no brain. That wild rice. They don't know what to do, but the wild rice that is in a community, it's just like it's home. So in many examples, of the knowledge, has been, like can be, like, but internally, what's your heart telling you, where are you coming, like in which place, is cultural space or spirituality, plays an important role. I pray and say, even when that moment say, what I'm going to do with rock parts? I'm not I mean, I'm from Southern Sonora. I said like, yeah, I know my ancestors walked this path, but like, I think we can learn together, or relearn this knowledge, together. So yeah, we could talk more about it, in some ways, now we have WhatsApp, Facebook. I call, like this morning I'm praying and I say, Companino, give me the blessing, please. I'm gonna talk about, what we're doing. And it's, like use any resources. Yeah.
Are there any questions? No? Okay. Any other questions here?
There's a question online.
Oh, basically, somewhat the same question. How difficult is it to find the elders who are able and willing to share this knowledge, present this knowledge? Is it easy to do? Is it hard to do? Are they anxious to help, and so on?
Like as an indigenous scientist, and it's just understanding protocol is very important. So every one of us understand our protocols, in our group, at home. So we have our own rules, our protocols. And, like, but the mutual understanding, that we are, we come with good heart, and then we're trying to collaborate, like respectfully, the understanding, respectfully, and then knowing that, like, we are in the same space, some elders open, and, like, when a good friend, a good brother, brings you to their tribe, it's significant, it's meaningful, and that's what happened. I've been adopted as so many people, so many people have, kindly share with me and, say, yeah, we understand you're far, you need a family, come with us. I mean, it doesn't happen that way, but I was going to say, what I mean is just that, in the space, when we are in the same space, when we are aligned, when we have shared goals, we will have shared concerns, it happens. Now, I'm not saying, like that's the only way to do it, but there's some, I mean, and I respect, always, there's even within my family, there's people that hasn't followed, it's not following the ancestors path, which I respect too. So there's people that, like, yeah, so indigenous people that is not doing science or is not following this path, and it's respectful too, but it depends a lot on the context sometimes, it depends on who you are, how you doing it. Sharing also, like from the heart, what we do and what it means, research as indigenous scientists and conservation, what it means are cultural significant plants for us. Is it means the same thing for other people? Is it the same thing, like the same concern, protecting, preserving germplasm? Are we going to, like, are we going to co-design together, a strategy? Those questions, like have open conversations far, far from, model the Yoreme Nation, where home is for me. But it's also how open the exchange, and say, yes, like as the example that I was sharing, and say, hey, have you consulted this book? An example, I was in Denver at the Crockwell Relatives meeting, an elder from the Vancouver, and say, hey, have you consulted these books? Like let's talk about, where you are. Let's talk about, I hear I know how you feel. I've seen it before. I can teach you some things. And like that's I appreciate it very much, and adopted again, being adopted, I appreciate very much, that my mijo here, say, Tio, say, yeah, I take you seriously. I'm an uncle. Yes. Anyway, is that gives you, is that, how do you feel about you? We're good?
There's one question.
Go ahead and ask.
Oh, yeah. Is there any question online? Say, Martha.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for coming. And I want to thank IRES for inviting you. I love botanic gardens. Every time I travel, like different cities, I like to go to the botanical garden. So I have a couple questions, but I know we're running out of time, so you can answer them quickly. How is the prairie in the Midwest doing? And does your Chicago Botanic Garden work on that? And then also, if you could just talk a little bit about how your daily work is. If you go in, there are a lot of colleagues there, or you're lone ranger, or how does this work?
The prairie, like the efforts to restore prairie are significant. I have colleagues that have dedicated their life, to restore the prairie, and it is significant into what's the increasing the biodiversity of the prairie, restoring native and endemic, species, from the prairie. It's, you see these efforts, translated right now into, like healthy ecosystems. You see the efforts, like into continued learning, restoration, conservation practices. And it's just like as we move forward, like the example that I have, the prairie, my favorite example, and where am I in the Chicago Botanic Garden, is the Nature Conservancy and then it's just grasslands, where they're reintroducing buffalo and they're reintroducing, grassland, grassland prairie. That they do it, like, and they are doing a big effort, including indigenous voices. We hope that it will expand, to different areas in the prairie. We hope. My hope is that. My prayer is that. It's happening, people is going harvest, like in the traditional ways. And, like we recognize the need, of more, indigenous people going in the, in the prairie grassland as the original range that they did it, back in history before they were removed from the land. So now my daily life is very interesting. I pray in the morning. I go grab a cup of coffee. And then I go and then check my plants and I talk to my plants. And that's what I've been taught, how to do things. Plants, like are my relatives. And I, try to teach something good, to my students, something good to my colleagues. I try to be respectful, in this space. I understand, our differences, sometimes. Some people, it goes, extend their concerns, and indigenous people, indigenous person, in the science center. There's not that many. I wish there were more. I hope in the future there are going to be more indigenous scientists. So it's a pretty regular, scientist, like a life. I go and do measurements too, I go write papers. I go talk to people. I go in Zoom meetings. I go long meetings in campus. I talk with members, I love talking with members too. And it's just like people asking me, say, hey, you look a little bit different, Say, yeah, let's talk about it. I'm Mexican, very regular Mexican with sombrero chicharrón. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to come to Chicago, come and visit me.
All right.
Cool. We're going to go to.
Yeah.
Sir.
All right.
Well, at least for the rest of us.
Perfect.
All right. So can we give Hector a round of applause? We want to thank everybody who joined us today. Again, all of our co-sponsors, IRES, the UA Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, the WRRC, and then the Office of Societal Impact. And again, to Cultural Survival for making this seminar very, very much possible. This concludes the 2026 Native Voices in STEM seminar series. We look forward to picking back up again in fall 2026. So we hope to see you then.